Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's colloquium. We are very pleased to welcome our today's speaker, Dr. Eric Oberheim from the Institute of Philosophy at the Humboldt University of Berlin, a world-leading expert on Feyerabend. Dr. Oberheim graduated with a BA in philosophy and psychology from Williams College in Massachusetts, and subsequently embarked on postgraduate studies at Cambridge in England with an MPhil. He earned his PhD from Leibniz University in Hanover under the supervision of Professor Paul Feyerabend. Dr. Oberheim is, to a significant extent, responsible for the wonderful Feyerabend Renaissance that we are fortunate enough to currently be witnessing in contemporary philosophy of science. He's the co-author of the Stanford Encyclopedia entries on incommensurability, and as of later this year, on Feyerabend. His main ongoing present projects involve 3 volumes on Feyerabend's formative years, including the publication of his correspondence and hitherto unpublished manuscripts, as well as a revived and extended edition of Feyerabend's Science as an Art. His magisterial 2006 Feyerabend's Philosophy, published with De Gruyter, is a systematic and stimulating reconstruction of Feyerabend's work that I encourage everybody to read. I furthermore would like to draw your attention to 2 other works of Eric's that should be of interest to a wider audience. He, of course, won my heart with his 2014 paper, Rediscovering Einstein's Legacy, How Einstein Anticipates Kuhn and Feyerabend on the Nature of Science, which appeared in Studies in History and Philosophy of Science. Given the centrality of the topic of progress, scientific progress in our colloquium series so far, I'd like to also mention his Scientific Progress and Incommensurability, a beautiful contribution to the excellent Routledge edited volume, New Perspectives on Scientific Progress. Today, however, Dr. Oberheim will talk about Paul Feyerabend from the limited validity of falsificationism to anything goes. Thank you very much, Eric, for kindly accepting our invitation to speak here today. We are delighted and honored to have you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for this invitation. It's nice to meet all of you. I guess I should mention this is the Feyerabend centennial year. So there are like all these Feyerabend conferences. So I've been like running around giving Feyerabend talks at Feyerabend conferences. And, I had to do a lot of research to finish this. The second one, it's now I'm waiting for the proofs to come in. Springer has it, and it's almost done, and this one will take some more years. I haven't wrote the edit. It's just, it's only been transcribed. There's no editorial apparatus yet. But this one should be, the middle one should be out later this year, and the first one was published in 2020. And so that's been keeping me busy, editing Feyerabend's stuff. Also, as he mentioned, I'm editing, I found this science, Wissenschaft als Kunst. There's no English translation. The Feyerabend community has been clamoring for an English translation. It turns out he had an English version that he never published, revised and extended. So I'm working on that too. And one thing I should correct him, my 2006 book is terrible. Don't read it. It's called Feyerabend's Philosophy. I just wrote a new book on Feyerabend. It's called, I'm not sure, something like Unlimited Validity of Falsificationism. And it will be published in some online Polish journal called Aspects of Origins. I don't know, they wanted something on Feyerabend, so I sent them a book manuscript, and they said, oh yeah, we'll publish it for free online. So there'll be a free, updated version of Feyerabend's Philosophy online available. Okay, so.
But it's not yet available. Will be in the next.
It's like the middle one. I sent it to them in November.
Okay.
And they said, yeah, we have to typeset it. And I said, what's the word length? And the guy wrote, anything goes. So I said, okay. The joke was that he had invited me to contribute like the year before. And when he said November, I was thinking November 2024, because 2024 is the centennial year. But he meant November 2023 to publish then at the beginning of 2024. So he's calling me like, he's writing an email the first week of November and saying, come on, we're giving this paper from you. You're like this big guy, we need this thing. I was like, oh, yeah, give me 3 weeks. And he said, sure. I said, okay. What's the word length? And he said, anything goes. So I gave him this close to 100,000 words. It's kind of a mess because I wrote it like once through, but there's a lot of new material in there. Anyway, I'm going to run out of time if I tell too many stories. So against metaphysics, there are 6 versions of this work. Well, 7 or 8 if you include von der Beschränkten Gültigkeit und methodologische Wegen, which I translated. The first thing I did with Feyerabend got involved was to translate that essay into English. And so the first English essay was in 1970, and that's where he uses his famous slogan, anything goes. And anything goes, for those of you who don't know it, the idea was the limited validity of methodological rules, right? So you come up with a methodological rule, Feyerabend says, I'll show you an instance of progress where they had to break that rule in order to make the progress. So that was the basic idea. And then it became, in the 1975 English book, became an international bestseller. It's been translated to I don't know how many languages. Somebody just sent me a copy of Tyranny of Science, which is a book I edited of his in Arabic, I think. I'm not quite sure what that language is. You want it in some Asian language? Or...
I know the translation of the Arabic version.
Yeah, it's like, this book is very popular. It continues to be very popular. As far as I can tell, it sells more copies from that press than all the other things that press sells that year. So really, the whole operation with Verso is financed by one book. It pays for all the other books. They publish 100 books a year, which don't make money. So the 2010 version is just the third English revised version, 93. And the only thing that I wanted to remark about this is that every version is different. And no 2 versions are the same. It's like, and there's no systematic changes either. He just felt like doing this and felt like doing that. And the Feyerabend experts at the conference in Texas a couple of weeks ago, or last month or whatever that was, they're calling for someone to like make an edition, a critical edition that marks all the changes. Feyerabend was not that serious. You don't need like, the changes were not that thought through. They were, it was nice. But anyway, so I thought, guys, come on, like, bad enough to have to read all of those. Like, you want to have more. So, okay, so here's a brief timeline because I'm going to try to explain to you basically Feyerabend's peculiar ideas on meaning and method from start to finish, which is very ambitious in 45 minutes. So I'm going to have to go faster. So timeline is basically also going to be our outline. And so I'm going to take you through these steps historically. We're going to look at it historically. So in 1948, Karl Popper, who was his mentor, people at the time in the 40s and 50s, late 40s, 50s, and early 60s, thought of Feyerabend as Popper's pit bull. And then in 1949, Feyerabend was trying to get his PhD at the University of Vienna in physics and failing. And he was working as an assistant to Felix Ehrenhoff, who was an experimental physicist who had some strange experimental effects. Then he met Ludwig Wittgenstein personally, face to face. He managed actually to invite Wittgenstein to a meeting of the Third Vienna Circle, or the Crafts Circle, and Wittgenstein actually came to everybody's surprise. And Wittgenstein was like, after Popper and Wittgenstein and Ehrenhoff were like his 3 father figures. And he considered them father figures. And I'll try to explain why. And then the next most influential person on Feyerabend's formative development was then David Bohm, who we met in 1957 in Bristol when Bohm came from Vorzingen, I think it's called. He came from Vorzingen and then he came for a conference at the Colston conference, and then he started 2 months later. He took up a post at Bristol where Feyerabend had been since 1955. 57. So Feyerabend and Bohm were together from 57 to 58 in Bristol, and then Feyerabend left for Berkeley, and yeah. But they were down the hall from each other, they became friends, they both did, neither of them liked Rosenfeld, and so they kind of bonded over that. So then 1962, Explanation, Reduction, Empiricism. That's Feyerabend's big early paper. That represents his early mature philosophy. That's where he introduces the term incommensurable, and basically draws together all his earlier work into a kind of collage, like Against Method is a collage. Well, this is a collage of his earlier stuff. And he had 4 aspects of his work. He was writing 12 book reviews on formal logic and its history in 1955 and 1956. 12 book reviews in 2 years on formal logic and its history. And so then he was working on Wittgenstein analytic philosophy, and he was working on foundations of quantum theory, and he was working on general methodology. And this paper pulls it all together and represents his early mature view. From 62 to 67, he sort of, or 65, let's say, he was kind of developing this early view, but he arrived at it his mature view in 62. And he kind of tinkered with it between 62, and then he, had this big transition where he woke up in 1967. So in 65, he wrote this paper. He changed his view, not just he had this idea of limited validity of theories he got from Bohm. I'll talk about it later. And then in 65, he met Karl von Weizsäcker, whose center we're at. And Feyerabend blamed actually Weizsäcker for his turn to anarchism. So I'll try to explain how that happened. And then we'll get to Feyerabend's awakening, and that's like the big highlight of my new Feyerabend research, because for the last 10 years, people are, even longer, people are arguing about Feyerabend's relationship to Popper. What happened there? First, he was Popper's pitbull, and later he was like one of the most outspoken Popper critics. So people always talking about how that happened. The new theory was in 2016 with Matteo Colloquium's work that he was projecting his anti-Popper back in history. So after they had this dramatic personal break, Feyerabend said, "Oh no, I didn't like Popper's stuff from the beginning, and I disagreed with it the whole time." And then people started to say, "Well, wait a minute, come on, that doesn't seem to add up." And so they started to accuse him of kind of projecting backward his anti-Popperian earlier. And I want to argue that this is wrong, that there was an anti-Popperian aspect the whole time. So, and that will bring us after his awakening on December 17th, 1967. He makes a big announcement. I had an awakening, I had an epiphany about Popper. And then he reversed himself on realism from correcting common knowledge with science. So all his early philosophy is about correcting common knowledge with science. We should use science to correct common sense, everyday language, because common sense and everyday language is holding science back. We got to correct it, and that will help science move forward. And of course, after his reversal, he wants to protect common knowledge from scientism. He thinks, oh my God, what a scientist I was, a scientismist, or however you say that. So he looked back at his own work in a kind of derogatory way. So, questions? That's the plan. See if I can manage it. So I'm going to reduce that into 4 steps. Step 1, when he arrived at his peculiar views on meaning and method in the early 1950s, so let's say 1951, we'll take that as our date, where in order to understand Feyerabend, you have to understand that it was Feyerabend versus Popper on basic statements. Yeah, the step that's going to be that's the context out of which Feyerabend's weird ideas grew. He tried to synthesize Feyerabend and Popper, and he found a problem with Popper's basic statements, given Wittgenstein's views on meaning. The second step is explanation, reduction, empiricism. I want to try to explain to you his early view, where he argues that Popper's falsificationism cannot take incommensurability into account. There needs to be disinfected of its empirical core, basic statements. And then step 3 will be Feyerabend's awakening. We'll have Feyerabend's big announcement. I'm leaving the Popper school, Feyerabend's epiphany. I'm not a Popperian anymore. I was watching Lakatos and I realized, oh my God, I'm not a Popperian. I'm against method, and anything goes. Yeah, Feyerabend's hedonism. Okay? And then, so that will take us to the last little bit, which will be very fast, will be then what's the difference between the later Feyerabend and the earlier Feyerabend after this reversal. And there I'm just going to give a very kind of general account. So, step 1, 1948, Karl Popper. Feyerabend and Popper met in 1948 in Altbach. They took to each other immediately. Popper offered him the Dutzen within like an hour or something of their meeting, and they went for this long walk, and Feyerabend was enchanted by Popper, and Popper gave this lecture called The Aim of Science, where he set out his view of falsificationism. So, in order to understand Feyerabend, in order to understand me, you need to make a distinction, not a lot of people do this, between falsificationism and critical rationalism. Critical rationalism is a framework or a tradition that traces back to the Ionian philosophers like Thales, and everything is water. The idea is you make a bold conjecture and then you criticize it. And through the process of criticizing it, you improve it. And that's how knowledge improves, that's how progress happens. That was that idea since the Ionians that Popper says, okay, I belong to this tradition, says Popper. And I think it was Bartley coined the phrase critical rationalism, I think in the early 60s. Popper didn't call himself a critical rationalist, right? Somebody else, one of his students called him a critical rationalist. But anyway, so I'm using these terms in my way, and not the way that Feyerabend thought of those words, or that other people thought of these words at the time. I'm saying in order to understand this philosophy, you have to understand that he adopted, endorsed critical rationalism, Feyerabend, Popper's framework, but he criticized his normative methodology, falsificationism. And if you don't make a clear distinction there, you can't understand Feyerabend, because he looks like he's saying all this good stuff about Popper and all this bad stuff about Popper at the same time. Doesn't seem to make any sense. But once you make a very clear distinction between these two things, all falls into place. You see that he's criticizing falsificationism, which everyone I hope knows is conjectures and reputations we propose, nature disposes, and that's what his target is going to be. So, more basic Popper. Popper has the hypothetical deductive model of testing a theory. I hope you've all heard of it, the HG model, deductivism, as opposed to inductivism. And what people don't know is that the HG model is a direct refutation. You have a theory, you deduce, you have some auxiliary hypothesis and what boundary condition, you deduce some singular observable statement that swan is black. And if your theory is all swans are black and you have all swans are white, and you have a black swan, you falsify your theory, and it's directly refuted. But that's not a falsification. That's a direct refutation. For Popper, a falsification is an indirect refutation. And for Popper, scientific progress doesn't work with direct refutation, because when you have a direct refutation, you're left with an open question. You don't know what to do. You don't know whether this anomaly is a single instance, whether you should give up the theory. You don't know what to do. But in a falsification, the issue is closed. And the falsification has two conditions. The new theory has to correctly predict everything the established theory correctly predicted. And the new theory has to predict what the established theory incorrectly predicts. So one of its basic statements. So for Popper, remember, all swans are white. Is testable because there's a basic statement that is a black swan, which would falsify it. So the relation between, in the Aim of Science in 1948, as Popper explains it, that Newton's theory falsifies Kepler's laws, just as Einstein's theory falsifies Newton's theory, right? Okay, well, so that's my understanding of how Feyerabend understood Popper. You have these two conditions. Yeah. Then in 1949, so Feyerabend met Popper, he thought, okay, cool, Popper. I like Popper. So in 1949, he was working as assistant to Felix Ehrenhard, who was some sort of renegade experimental physicist. You know, renegade is the right word, I don't know. He was considered to be a charlatan by many. He fought against Millikan with respect to the oil dot experiment. And he accused Millikan of fudging his data, cleaning his data without admitting it, because he was an experimental physicist. He said, look, when I run this experiment, I get noise. These results you get where nothing is that version. So he accused Millikan of cheating, and of course, he lost because we believe in electrons now, and well, he went back to Vienna in kind of disgrace, and later on it turned out that Millikan did actually leave out bits of data that didn't fit well into his account. So anyway, so he was working for this guy who was really considered to be a charlatan. Einstein was telling colleagues in Vienna, don't let him, have PhD students, don't let him too close to the students. He had all these weird ideas. He was an anti-theory guy. So Feyerabend was working for this guy. This guy was building these weird effects from bottom up, so to speak. He would take like some graphite dust, like in a movie. He would put it in a bottle, in a jar, and he would pump out the gas, and then put the prism and get some sunlight, and then watch the graphite dust start to rise up into the air and make a spiral pattern and go round and round like in Sherlock Holmes with the bugs, And he's going, and he's, how do you see conservation of energy? Wrong. Yeah. So Rosenfeld and Price were there, and they were like, black effects. Too many overlapping stuff, doesn't prove anything. And Feyerabend was working for Ehrenhard, and no one was taking him seriously. And this started problems of empiricism. Feyerabend's becoming interested. How does it work? When can we say that a theory an experiment actually, refutes a theory. Because no one is taking these experiments seriously that I spent all these hours building for this guy. And so that was the question. And Popper's theory comes with an answer to that question. It says, I know when you take an experiment seriously, when it's a falsification. Yeah? If you have a falsification, anyone who doesn't agree that the new theory is better is irrational. They should go to the new theory because it explains everything the old theory did plus more. Yeah? And the more is the old theory gets wrong. Right? And if you're in this situation, you have these two choices, then falsification dictates the reasonable thing to do is to take the falsifying theory, not the falsified theory. So that's how it all gets started. Ehrenhoff has this problems of empiricism, and then he meets Popper, who has this solution, who can tell you when an experiment should be taken seriously. So then it steps in Leonard Wittgenstein, right? So we're in Vienna, and Feyerabend befriends Elizabeth Anscombe, who was, working for Wittgenstein, who edited the investigations and translated it into English. And he knew he was going to die of cancer, and he gave her the manuscripts, and she went back to Vienna to learn German well enough to translate from German into English. And she met Feyerabend, and Feyerabend wanted to publish in English, and so they became friends and had a study group, and they met every week and they discussed it, and she shared the manuscripts with him. So he'd seen the investigations before anybody else, before it was published. So he was sitting with Anscombe deciding, helping her make decisions about how to translate the stuff. And his very first publication in English is actually a big book review on Wittgenstein. So Feyerabend's first publication, it's like a 50-page critical reconstruction of Wittgenstein's argument in the investigation, with lots of different symbols and like crosses for paraphrases and quotes for quotes and stars for things that follow, but it's complicated. Anyway, that was his first big publication. Anscombe actually translated from German to English for him. Doesn't actually say that in the paper, but elsewhere he mentioned that she did that for him. And from Wittgenstein, he got the contextual theory of meaning. The idea that the meaning of a term or the meaning of a sentence is determined by the theory that's used to interpret it. So the example I like to use is the ball fell. You say the ball fell. You ask, what does the ball fell mean? And the one guy says, well, the ball fell means it was pulled by its pushed by its impetus from within. And the other guy goes, no, it was pulled by gravity from outside. Maybe even a new guy would come and say something about geometric states and have a different account of what falling means. But the same sentence, the ball fell, is used to test radically different theories about the nature of fall. This is what Feyerabend got from Wittgenstein. He got the idea that of nominalism, that terms and sentences don't have meanings like realistic world three universals. The idea that words and sentences are just physical objects, nothing else. It's nominalism. They're just physical objects. And meaning is just people's dispositions to behave in a certain way. And Feyerabend was a kind of a physicalist at this point. He wanted to have a completely physicalist, empirical theory of meaning, an empirically testable theory of meaning that treats sentences like physical objects, which are then later interpreted. So, and he also took from Feyerabend the idea of constructivism, that we live in worlds of facts, not things. That this is constructed facts that we interact with, and not mind-independent, objectively neutrally existing things. So 1962, his early paper, Explanation and Reduction of Empiricism, is a synthesis of Wittgenstein's insights on meaning with Popper's insights on method. And then I mentioned just at the bottom here, Wittgenstein's role in Feyerabend's reversal and realism. As it turns out, Wittgenstein was not only the most influential person on Feyerabend's, in a positive way, on Feyerabend's early philosophy, but he was also extremely central to Feyerabend's later reversal, as we'll see. The insight I just mentioned now from Wittgenstein that Feyerabend really caught Feyerabend's attention was this Jastro's stuck rabbit. This idea that one sentence can make two different statements. And the context here is important. You have to know the background is that Popper thought that Wittgenstein was his arch rival, his nemesis in philosophy. He thought Popper thought that Wittgenstein was getting credit for Popper's ideas. Yeah, and do you all know the Popper story? Anyone read this book? You familiar? I see people smiling. So yeah, there was this big event where there was this thing. This is all, if you read the explanation of action empiricism carefully, you see in a footnote that he says something like, he's talking about the law of conservation of energy, and the example he uses to show that it's not this like momentum, it's not the same thing as something else back then, is the heat leaving a piping hot poker. Like this example, like he's trying to synthesize Wittgenstein and Feyerabend's views, and he's making jokes in the footnotes about the context. There's a lot going on there. The paper is also structured as a big reveal. And it's not like a normal essay where it says, here's what I'm going to tell you. At the beginning, it says, I'm going to show you that Nagel is wrong, Hempel is wrong on explanation, and the Nagel is wrong on reduction. And then I'm going to show you that contemporary empiricism has the same problem. But it doesn't tell you who. In the first paragraph, it says, some philosophers thought that if language has this all-powerful, that it all-pervasive function, that it kind of permeates all my experiences, how could I use experience to, somehow change my language? He says some philosophers then got scared by this and retreated to instrumentalism, but he doesn't say who. Then later in a footnote, you learn he means Wittgenstein. So he says, I meant Wittgenstein. So it's a mini reveal, but the big reveal is who's the contemporary empiricist going to be? After Hempel is wrong and Nagel is wrong, what's going to happen here? So we'll see. So getting back to Bohm, we got to fly back. So in 1957, David Bohm and Feyerabend meet when Bohm takes a job in Bristol after he left Haifa in Israel. And there was a long history here because Feyerabend was in the room when Bohr found out about Bohm's hidden variables proposal. He just happened to be in Copenhagen in the room, and someone had just told Bohr that Bohm had made this hidden variables proposal, and Bohm was like amazed and like shocked and amazed, and Feyerabend started working on the measurement problem and no hidden variables alleged proof on von Neumann. And that was what he was working on in Foundation of Quantum Theory from 1952 up, until 1969. He was working on this issues in Foundation of Quantum Theory. And when Bohm and Weizsäcker put out there in 1954 new hidden variables theory, it was completely ad hoc. They said we're going to develop a theory that will explain the already known results. And in 1957, at the Colloquium conference, they showed up and said, we did it. We have now a theory that's empirically equivalent with the standard formalism, the standard way the theory is presented. It predicts exactly the same results. So you cannot, for any good empirical reason, say that you are better than we are. And they say, of course, no, that's completely ad hoc, and you're reintroducing philosophy. Boom, we just got rid of philosophy, we just got it out of physics. We're positivists, Rosenfeld and Price. Yeah, that was the whole Colloquium conference. And only the reason that I get into all of this because I just wrote this really long chapter for the #2 book, because we found this Bohm paper from 1959, where Bohm is responding to Feyerabend's 1960 published review of Bohm's 1957 book. So Bohm writes a book in 57, Feyerabend writes in 1959 a review, and he gives it to Bohm, and Bohm writes a 38-page response. And it's basically why my methodology of the qualitative infinity of nature, my being Bohm, is better than Popper's falsificationism. And here's 38 pages why, and here's 16 reasons, and I'll summarize them at the end. And it's a thrashing of falsificationism in a way. So, and this 1959 response from Bohm to Feyerabend criticizing Popper, which was never published, which will be published in the second volume, unknown Bohm paper, Bohm, this big guy. This is actually turns out to be the key, as far as I can tell, to understanding what happens here. So we'll see. So in 1957, at the conference, Bohm was arguing for pluralism and tolerance. He was saying, guys, my theory is empirically equivalent with yours. You have no good scientific reasons for rejecting it. And you need to be more tolerant, and we need pluralism. We need lots of different theories. If we have different theories, maybe we could make progress better if we all just stick to the one. And then he said, I haven't even, I'll give you an example. Look at the kinetic theory, the theory of atoms, right? It had no empirical support. And people believed in it for a long time. And then Einstein comes along and shows a way, to empirically test it with Brownian motion. He says if we make these measurements, we can show that, And then this is an indirect refutation, says Bohm, of classical phenomenological thermodynamics. The Brownian particle is moving all around and never stops. You know what Brownian particle is, right? No, okay. I can't explain that, it would take too long. So Bohm was saying basically, look, maybe some Einstein will come along and figure out a way to test my new theory and show that it can predict something that the standard theory cannot. So you shouldn't be, that happens in science. So you cannot just rule me out and say it's not science. It could come along, somebody could find a way to falsify the existence theory by predicting some new kind of effect from my theory. Just like Einstein predicted a new kind of effect from kinetic theory, which then showed that classical phenomenological thermodynamics was wrong. That heat is actually caused by molecular motion. So that was Bohm's argument. And then Bohm also rejected what Feyerabend calls the autonomy principle. The autonomy principle tells you that facts exist independently of the theories used to understand them. So Feyerabend's view and Bohm's view actually is that the facts only exist within frameworks. You take away the frameworks, there are no facts. The world is not made up of facts. Worlds are made of facts that are kind of co-constituted by frameworks and interactions between subjects and objects. Something like this. So, and the reason that this 1959 response is so key to Feyerabend's development is because Bohm says that falsificationism needs to be made testable by showing that it has only a limited validity. Falsificationism is just, yeah, you should do this. And Bohm says, well, that's meaningless. If you can tell me when I should do this and when I shouldn't do this, then that's informative. So what I need is a theory of verification to complement my theory of falsification or refutation, says Bohm. And he says that falsification only works within frameworks, but you cannot use it to compare frameworks to each other. In this 1959 response, he makes these points. So, and we're going to jump quickly to, we'll get back to Bohm, but we're going to jump quickly to Albert Einstein. Why? Because Bohm told Feyerabend, go and read Einstein and Brownian motion. Go look at the example. That's the argument for pluralism. What happened there? So Feyerabend, this is now my hypothesis as an historian. Bohm tells Feyerabend, because Brownian motion was Bohm's big example. It was like his main example of everything, right? So he had classical Brownian motion, he had subquantum Brownian motion, he used Brownian motion to illustrate all kinds of things. And one of them was his argument for pluralism. And so he tells Feyerabend, go and look at the Einstein case. And Feyerabend picks up the Einstein autobiographical notes, where Einstein explains how he did this magical feat with Brownian motion. And there, what we find Einstein using the term incommensurable to refer to competing general theories, universal theories that apply to everything. Exactly the same way that Feyerabend distinguishes which theories can be incommensurable, only universal theories or general theories. And he says, because of basic differences in the concepts and the relations between them, trying to compare universal theories is like trying to a reciprocal way of incommensurable tolerance. So it fits so well to what Feyerabend is saying. He's using the same term to apply to the same thing, general theories, to talk about difference in basic concepts in the same way. So this is where I think he got the term incommensurable. The idea he had are much longer. And what else did Feyerabend get from Einstein? Well, if you look where he talks about incommensurable, in the same paper there, Einstein says, my theoretical attitude is distinct from that of Kant only by the fact that we don't conceive of the categories as unalterable, conditioned by the nature of the understanding, but as in the logical sense, free conventions. They appear to be a priori only insofar as thinking without the positing of categories and of concepts in general would be as impossible as breathing in a vacuum. So he says, I'm a Kant on wheels. This is what Peter Lipton coined as Kant on wheels, and Hornig and Hune develops as the kind of metaphysics underpinning Hune's position. And in Explanation, Reintroduction, Empiricism, on page 2, it says, my theoretical attitude is distinct from Kant's, only in that it changes. It's like, okay, so it's the same basic idea. Yeah. And then the other thing that everyone loves to point to is that, against method seems to be the sentiment that whatever works. It's not anything actually goes. It's whatever works, works. And not anything actually goes. And so, of course, Feyerabend loved to quote Einstein, the external conditions which are set for the scientist by the fact of experience do not permit him to be himself to be too much restricted in the construction of his conceptual world by the adherence to an epistemological system. He therefore must appear to be a systematic epistemologist as a type of unscrupulous opportunist. And Feyerabend used to say, when people give him a hard time for being an epistemological anarchist, that's just paraphrasing Einstein. Yeah, so back to Bohm. So now we get 1967. So in 1957, he meets Bohm and Bohm becomes his hero. And when he's arguing in general methodology for tolerance and pluralism in his papers, he's arguing for Bohm. He's arguing you guys should be more tolerant of Bohm. We should have more quantum theories or interpretations of quantum theory, not fewer. This is what Feyerabend was directly connected to this. It was not just some abstract stuff. So Bohm was Feyerabend's champion. And so what happens in Explanation, Reduction, Empiricism? Well, Bohm's argument becomes Feyerabend's argument for pluralism. Maybe some Einstein will come along. We need new theories because otherwise there are facts that can only be discovered with the help of the new theory. And these facts show the existing theory to be wrong, but we need the new theory in order to discover these facts. So we should always be pluralists. No matter how good the theory is, we should always try to come up with an alternative, because only the alternative might be the only way of showing that the established theory is wrong. Right? And so that's the point of the Brownian motion example, that you need statistical thermodynamics to make the calculations that show that classical phenomenological thermodynamics is wrong. You can't, when you look at Brownian motion and you have only phenomenological thermodynamics, you think, well, there must be energy coming from somewhere, right? And let's build a shield. Well, we build the shield, no energy going in. Well, it's still moving. There must be energy coming from somewhere. So let's build a better shield. But you're never going to give up the law of the conservation of energy, right? You're always going to come up with some ad hoc reason why this thing doesn't stop before you give up on the laws of physics. So that was the whole Brownian motion example. The point of it is that you need the new theory. So I need to go faster. So the Brownian motion example becomes his main example from ERE all the way through against method. Criticism of falsificationism. Yeah? In Explanation, Reduction, Empiricism, Feyerabend criticizes Popper for the first time. And he does it exactly in the way that Bohm suggested. We're going to get to that in a minute. And also we find Feyerabend explicitly adopting Bohm's autonomy principle. So this is why Bohm is the most important positive influence on Feyerabend in this time period. So, Explanation, Reduction, Empiricism, synthesis of Wittgenstein and Popper. Yeah, from one. Wittgenstein, he says, yeah, there are genuinely philosophical pseudo-problems caused by grammar. Yeah, but grammar is just mysterious. What really is happening is there's antiquated scientific principles from Aristotelianism and from Newtonianism that are still governing the everyday use of normal language, but the new theories are incompatible with that. Yeah, and that causes then conceptual confusion, which are these Wittgensteinian pseudo-problems. So Feyerabend gives an explanation of what a Wittgensteinian problem is, why it happens. And he also gives a positive role to these pseudo-problems in science. Part of making scientific progress is clearing these conceptual problems up. Yeah, he puts Wittgenstein's problems, pseudo-problems, in as part of scientific progress. So, but he criticizes Wittgenstein's quietism, his conception of philosophy, his conception of the relationship between science and philosophy. Is none of that, right? So Feyerabend is a normative philosopher. So he's the opposite of quietism. He wants to correct common sense, not say nothing. He doesn't want to leave everything as it is. He wants to improve stuff. Feyerabend is completely anti-Wittgenstein in this sense, or at least how he reads Wittgenstein, let's say. So from Popper, he takes the hypothetical deductive model, then he takes critical rationalism, yeah, but he criticizes the main conclusion of this paper, which I seem to be the only one who knows how to read this paper, because when I talk to other Feyerabend experts, they're like, really? I'm like, yeah, look, it's the main conclusion. It's summary and conclusions. Here now, I promised you, I'll show you contemporary empiricism has the same problem. Yeah? And then the summary and conclusions. Hempel's wrong, Nagel's wrong, Popper's wrong. All of a sudden Popper comes in, a whole page of reconstructing Popper's theory, and then I don't think this works. Why? Because of incommensurability. Uh-oh. So this paper, yeah, he criticizes Hempel on explanation. Hempel's theory of explanation is that one explanation is better than another. It explains everything the original one does plus more. Huh? Feyerabend says, well, you can't take incommensurability into account. And then Nagel's theory of reduction says, yeah, the new theory should explain. We should be able to deduce the existing theory as a special case of the new theory. And Feyerabend says, no, that can't take incommensurability into account. And then, as promised in the introduction, he turns to contemporary empiricism, and who just represents it? Popper. And what does he say? Popper. Yeah, the main conclusion, it does not seem to me that Popper's empiricism, that's the it here, can deal with the case where T and T are incommensurable. A formal and objective account of explanation cannot be given. What he's trying to say is that after a scientific revolution, the new theory cannot explain the old sentences. Even though we use the same sentences, we still say the ball fell, but we don't explain their sentence, the ball fell, because their sentence, the ball fell, expressed the fact that it was being pushed by its impetus. So there's no way to give a formal account of scientific progress, because although the sentences stay the same, they get incompatible meanings. Yeah? So one sentence makes two statements, yeah? Plus the hypothetical deductive model results in incommensurability. Yeah? The ball fell, it was pushed or it was pulled. Incommensurable theories have no formally comparable consequences, objective or otherwise. If your theory predicts the ball falls and my theory predicts the ball falls, these are not logically consistent theories. If the ball represents mass which can change, and this ball represents mass that cannot change. And these are not the same sentences. They make different statements, the ball falling, if we deduce them from theories that have different instantiations of mass. So here's how you can think about incommensurability. You got Newton's theory on one side, Einstein's theory on the other side. Yeah. In order to test the theories, you got to deduce from them something observable, a singular statement, like the wheel will spin. Yeah? And then you go and check. And if the wheel spins, then your theory was right. And if your theory predicts the wheel will not spin, and the wheel doesn't spin, then you win, right? And so Feyerabend's point is that there's no reduction that's here. You cannot relate the theories to each other, because mass doesn't mean mass. And if you deduce one of these sentences from here, and you deduce from there, because of the meaning difference in the terms used to state the theory, the non-logical terms, because you can deduce A equals A from both and then compare them. But the anything that has empirical content, yeah, will be disjoint, deductively disjoint. Not only can you not relate the theories deductively to each other, but you cannot relate the sentences, statements deduced from the theories to each other. That's the argument. That's what incommensurability means. So it's a constructive criticism of Popper, because he says, okay, I have my own test model that works since revolutions, not falsification. And falsification works in normal science. Yeah, but in revolutions, it's not conjectures and refutations, it's conjectures and novel corroborations. Now look at the Brownian motion example. There's nothing predicted by phenomenological thermodynamics that was contradicted. There's just this kind of vague idea that it should stop. But what happened was they have a novel confirmation of a new theory-laden effect, and an effect that only can be described given the new theory. And so how can there be a falsification? They're disjoint, says Feyerabend. So what you have is you have more comprehensive theories, yeah, but not logically relatable theories. So you cannot say it's more true, or somehow has more truth, or it's truer, because truth is relative to the framework, and it cannot then be used to compare the frameworks. But at this time, in CC2, he's still trying, Feyerabend's trying to contribute to Popper's idea of a model for the acquisition of knowledge. So Feyerabend's test model is supposed to complement Popper's test model. It's supposed to show where it applies and where it doesn't, like what Bohm said. It's supposed to provide an account of corroboration. yeah, that complements falsification. So Bohm didn't understand that the opposite of falsification is not verification, it's corroboration. And Feyerabend was a professional philosopher, and Bohm wasn't. Feyerabend looked at Bohm's arguments and ideas against Popper and said, I know how to sharpen them up, that they're really pounding. And then he calls Popper, he says, you're a dogmatic ideology school philosopher. That's the accusation in explanation, reduction, empiricism. It's nothing worse for a critical rationalism to be called a dogmatist, right? Critical rationalism, no, dogma is the worst, right? Everything open to question, I'm not dogmatic. If you can show a critical rationalist he's being dogmatic, it's really, it hurts. And that's what he tried to do. So this slide we can kind of skip. The Feyerabend experts in the room tell me, what's the evidence for this interpretation? And I say, I have overwhelming evidence. We don't have time to go through it, but it's just, it's not open to discussion. It's a closed question. That's what the essay says. So then 1964, we get cultural pluralism. Feyerabend tells us they opened the universities to minorities. And all of a sudden I felt like I was teaching dead white man science. And who am I to tell these people how to think? This is important because this is going to set up the transition now. This is the kind of an important thing that happened in between 62 and 67. And then in 65, he meets Karl von Weizsäcker and Hamburg. And Weizsäcker says, can you help me with my problems and foundations of quantum theory? And Feyerabend says, well, blah, 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 general methodology, falsification, blah, 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 Brownian motion, test model, blah, blah, blah. And Weizsäcker says, how is that helpful? What am I supposed to do with that? Did it help me with my problem or not? And Feyerabend said, well, I felt like I had my pants down. I felt like, what the hell, yeah? So I really, no matter how cool my arguments are, he's right. This is just all abstract, polka blazana, blah, blah, blah. It's of no help to actual scientists. Yeah? And so at that moment, he decided to change from the positive model for the acquisition of knowledge to what he calls the skeptical phase in his correspondence. Yeah? Where he says, okay, maybe there isn't such a thing. So moving right along. Then we get to step 3, Feyerabend's awakening. This is all new. This is brand new stuff. Nobody knows this stuff. We just figured this stuff out because I was editing the Watkins and the Feyerabend correspondence. And I realized that I wrote letters on the same day telling the same story, and a really dramatic story. And I looked at it closer and closer and closer, and here's what it ends up, what it says. Yeah. By the way, these are 2 Popperians, right? Lakatos and Watkins. Just so we're clear. So he writes to Lakatos, listening to your lecture on Popperianism meant the end of my dogmatic slumber. My dogmatic slumber as a Popperian. And now I'm awake. At first I don't see anything at all except the reality I now imagine I'm seeing has nothing whatever to do with preceding Popperian dreams. But that's Feyerabend's awakening, Feyerabend's epiphany. And now, when I finally heard Imre's crystal clear lecture, I realized why I had changed. I had a curious feeling of utter unreality. Considering all this Popperianism now seemed to me like a nightmare, not at all better than Hegelian philosophy of nature, and that he means Bohm. So Bohm is the Hegelian philosophy of nature. That's just a nice way of saying Bohm. So basically, in the 1960 review of Bohm's book, the last sentence, the second last sentence is, I prefer falsificationism and Popper to Bohm and his nonsense about dialectics and Hegel. Yeah? And then in 1962, it's a different story. In 1962, it says, my starting point is the admirable Popper. And the next person he thanks is Bohm. And why? Because he's using Bohm's ideas to criticize Popper to try to break from Popper's school. In 1962, he was trying to announce that he had his own ideas about method, and falsificationism had only a limited validity. So I told the class why I could no longer follow certain tenets of Popperianism. I told them what my problems were. It was Popper's method. So some people speculate that he broke with Popper about quantum theory stuff, about foundation of quantum theory. No, it was about method. Here he says it's all wrong about Newton, Einstein, Kepler. That's exactly the 1948 paper on the aim of science he's referring to. Popper's paper. And that's exactly the argument he makes in Explanation, Reduction, and Empiricism. That Popper has the relation between Einstein and Newton wrong, and incommensurable. Newton and Kepler, commensurable. Einstein and Newton, incommensurable. And then he makes his point. Look, Popper says you cannot use ad hoc hypothesis to protect your theories. And Feyerabend said, well, without the context, I cannot buy onto that. Look at Bohm. I'm supporting Bohm. He has his ad hoc stuff. It depends on the context. Without the context, I learned from on Weizsäcker, I'm just talking, it's no help. So that brings us back to Ehrenhaupt, because in the postscript at the very bottom of the letter to Watkins, he says, did I send you the translation of Ehrenhaupt's lectures? This is from 15 years beforehand. Yeah, he's just mentioning this now and then. Did I ever send you that? Yeah, I think you will be amused, because now he's saying in this letter, yeah, ad hoc okay, sometimes not so good, other times it depends on the context. And this discussion was exactly Ehrenhaupt saying, they were saying, oh, these are Drake effects. And Ehrenhaupt is saying, oh, you're using ad hoc hypothesis to protect your theories from my direct refutations. But that was the problem with Ehrenhaupt's effects. They were not falsifications. They were direct refutations. They were built from the bottom up. So people were like, wow, what's that? And if Ehrenhaupt had come and shown how he could have deduced these effects from an alternative theory, he would have falsified the established theories. But he didn't do that. He just came with these effects and said, you see? So there was, Feyerabend realized the irony that he was back to square one. That's the point I want to make here, yeah? And the point with the basic statements in the Wittgenstein invitation at the beginning where it said, we're discussing Popper's basic, we're discussing basic statements and we're stuck. That's how Feyerabend got Wittgenstein to come. Because basic statements is code for Popper's methodology. Basic statements is Popper's term to distinguish himself from observation statements of the logical empiricists. So when he wrote on a postcard, he brought to Wittgenstein's house. Wittgenstein knew who he was from Anscombe and knew that he wanted to invite him because he'd come before to try to invite him orally, and the butler turned him away. I said, Herr Wittgenstein has heard of you, but he cannot help you. And he went back to Anscombe and said, come on, he wouldn't let me even see him. I couldn't get in the front door. And he said, write him a letter, but don't be too subservient. He hates that. So Feyerabend wrote one sentence. We're discussing basic statements and we're stuck. Wittgenstein showed up. Everyone couldn't believe it that Wittgenstein came, but Feyerabend was really, he knew exactly what button to push. And my point with the story is not so much about how cool Feyerabend was to get Wittgenstein to come, but he was stuck on basic statements in 1950. The criticism in explanation, reduction, empiricism is a criticism of Popper's notion of basic statements. Yeah? The reason he breaks from Popper in 1967 traces back all the way to 1950. There's no backward projection here. So I have 2 more minutes. Give me 1 minute. So this is really, because this is the quotes now. In these letters to Lakatos and Watkins on the same day where he announces his break and he explains why, he says, I'm now going to use the title against method, following Susan Sontag's against interpretation. And he says, besides, if I'm correct in what I said in my lectures to his students, yeah, in January and December 1967, he says, this is a letter from January. And in some of my arguments, then the improved method just says anything goes except those things which are inconsistent with hedonism. My anti-Kuhn paper will be written with the title against method. But here we have anything goes. Yeah, this is how he got there. He generalized from falsificationism has a limited validity, is limited to testing commensurable theories, to all methodological rules have a limited validity. It's a generalization from the ERE paper to against method. And last slide, I hope. This also is called Feyerabend's historical term, this moment. People talk about this historical term. And the reason is, in this, you can see these letters, he writes 2 historical books after this, Against Method and Naturphilosophy. And here he's announcing, I'm sick of Popper's normative epistemology. I embarrass myself in front of Weizsäcker. This is all in between the lines. And now I think I should just turn to history. Get away from this normative stuff. So his reversal on realism is from correcting common knowledge with science in his early stuff to protecting common knowledge from scientists in the late stuff. Realism, reject common sense, was objective reality was a metaphysical mistake. That's his early view. His late view, early view, instrumentalism is philosophy of defeat. Only realism is, real science making progress. In his late view, on the other hand, realism is just the wish of some people to, impose their ideology on others. And we have to make a choice. What do we want? Scientific efficiency or happy lives? And we should make our decisions about what to believe based on hedonism, what makes us happy, and not based on some, abstract stories that physicists tell themselves and like to pat themselves on the back about. So, last slide, I promise, almost. It was Wittgenstein's great merit to have emphasized that science contains not only formula and rules for the application, but entire traditions. Feyerabend says, as his stuff changes after 67 as he puts out more and more stuff. He says he gradually realized he'd missed this lesson from Wittgenstein, and it eventually finally sank in. And that's where the the late positive influence of when Wittgenstein and Feyerabend comes in. And so this is just this quote, anything goes, I was just joking. We all know what it means, we don't need to read it. This is just the first instance of it to show that how he got from the one anything goes in the letter to the anything goes in the article in 70. So these are my conclusions. Feyerabend's criticism remains constant. He just kept adding targets. He gave up his positive model for his skeptical phase in 65 because of Weizsäcker. He broke with Popper's school in 67 on the 17th of December because of methodology and his disagreement with falsificationism, not the quantum stuff. That was his anarchist phase or his historic turn. And there's no backward projection. Yeah, it was already a problem there since basic statements. And yeah, it was a generalization from the limited validity to the of falsification, the validity of all methodological rules, and the reversal as I thought. And thank you very much. And if you're bored during the discussion, you can play the picture puzzle. Thanks for having me.